And the morning the bells did not ring. London felt wrong, as if the city itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. The air carried a silence heavier than fog drifting across the Thames, and within that hush stood a woman who had once bent the rhythm of a kingdom to her presence. Anne Boleyn had not always walked toward silence, because there was a time when every doorway widened for her, and every courtier measured their words against the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She was not merely a queen, but a force. The woman who captured the devotion of Henry VIII, and in doing so helped redirect the course of England itself, unsettling centuries of tradition and loosening the grip of Rome over the English crown. And when such a figure falls, the impact travels far beyond a scaffold. The Tower of London had seen kings, traitors, and dreamers pass through its gates, yet it seemed to hold its breath when Anne entered, not in celebration, but under guard, because only a few years earlier she had approached those same walls amid celebration, escorted along the river with banners raised and crowds pressing forward for a glimpse of the woman who would become queen. But now there were no trumpets, no velvet canopy, only the scrape of footsteps and the quiet awareness that accusation had replaced admiration. The charges laid against her sounded dramatic enough to belong to legend. Treason, betrayal, conspiracy. Yet what unsettled observers was not just their severity, but their speed. For in the Tudor court, momentum could be as dangerous as malice, and once it began to move, it rarely reversed direction. Much of Anne's downfall grew not from spectacle, but from expectation, because in a world where a male heir meant security, she had given birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, who would one day become one of England's most formidable rulers. Though in that moment, she was seen only as a fragile uncertainty in a dynasty obsessed with sons, and as the king's attention shifted toward the quieter presence of Jane Seymour, the atmosphere around Anne cooled in ways more cutting than open hostility. Conversations shortened, glances lingered too long, invitations quietly vanished, and isolation settled around her long before iron gates did. When the trial convened, it carried the appearance of order, lords seated in judgment, formal language spoken with practiced gravity. Yet beneath the ceremony lay inevitability, because intelligence and composure, both of which Anne possessed, rarely outweigh a decision already forming in the shadows. The verdict of guilty did not erupt, but descended, and the swiftness with which events moved suggested not chaos, but design, for arrangements were made for a swordsman from France rather than the customary axe, a detail historians still examine with curiosity, some interpreting it as mercy because a sword in skilled hands could be precise, others seeing in it the unmistakable imprint of control, the king shaping not only the outcome, but the manner in which history would record it. On May 19th, the scaffold within the Tower grounds stood ready, the gathering smaller than the crowds that once celebrated her coronation, because this was not meant to stir unrest, but to conclude a narrative, and witnesses later described her composure with a kind of stunned respect. She wore subdued elegance, spoke carefully measured words that avoided direct accusation of the king, perhaps mindful of the daughter whose future might depend upon restraint. And in those final moments, she appeared less like a defeated figure, and more like someone determined to maintain dignity within circumstances she could no longer alter. The swordsman's presence added an unsettling quiet to the scene, and according to accounts, he used a subtle distraction before the final motion, a brief shift of attention that spared her the weight of anticipation, and then it was over swiftly, contained within seconds that felt stretched by tension. Yet the darkness of that day did not lie solely in the act itself, but in what followed, because there was no grand royal procession, no towering monument erected in her memory, only a simple burial within the chapel of the Tower, her remains placed in an unadorned chest and lowered into anonymity, as if the woman who had once commanded Europe's fascination could be reduced to silence by the absence of ceremony. Yet silence has a way of refusing permanence, and in the years and centuries that followed, her story lingered in corridors and in whispers. Visitors to the tower speaking of an atmosphere that felt unsettled near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Legends weaving themselves through stone and shadow not because of spectacle, but because of unresolved questions. Historians would later debate the strength of the evidence against her, many concluding it was fragile at best, which reframes her execution not as spontaneous fury, but as calculated removal, a political solution to a dynastic problem, clearing the path for a new marriage within days and signaling to every courtier that favor could dissolve overnight. The court adjusted, as courts always do, alliances reshaped, voices softened, ambition disguised itself in caution, and Anne's fate became a quiet lesson that proximity to power does not guarantee protection, that influence can transform into liability with unsettling speed, and that narratives can be rewritten by those who control the pen. When Elizabeth eventually rose to the throne, she did so carrying the shadow of her mother's end, rarely speaking of it, yet embodying an acute awareness of perception and authority, choosing never to marry and never to allow her sovereignty to hinge upon producing an heir, mastering the art of image in ways that suggested she understood intimately how fragile a queen's position could be. Centuries later, when renovations within the tower led to the identification of remains believed to be Anne's and a plaque was installed acknowledging her burial site, it felt less like closure and more like recognition long delayed. Because what truly made her execution worse than we imagine was not spectacle or prolonged suffering, but orchestration. The controlled efficiency with which a queen was transformed into a cautionary tale. The careful management of optics. The deliberate containment of reaction. The message sent to a nation that even a crowned figure could vanish within stone walls without public upheaval. Tourists now walk those grounds with cameras raised, listening to guides recount events in measured tones. Yet what lingers is not merely the fact of her death, but the chilling understanding of how quietly it reshaped a kingdom's culture, how laughter at court became more measured, how loyalty became performance, how ambition learned to conceal itself beneath smiles. And perhaps that is why Anne Boleyn's story endures. Not because it was the most violent chapter in English history, but because it was one of the most controlled, a reminder that power does not always thunder when it destroys, but can whisper with devastating precision, attempting erasure yet failing, because despite efforts to confine her to an unmarked resting place, her name persisted, her daughter reigned, her legacy refused to fade, and the morning the bells did not ring continues to echo through history, as proof that sometimes the most unsettling events are not the loudest, but the quietest.